You. Good morning. I should first just note, of course, you know this already, but the staff and all the clerks and everyone here are excellent. They make it so easy and great for us, hopefully for you all as well. So I wanted to just note that and my appreciation, as well as, of course, to the chairman and to the committee for the invitation and opportunity to be with you this morning to talk about Michigan's chemical industry. I'd like to be brief. I think you have the materials, so I'll try not to go into verbatim recap of all that, but give you a brief overview of our industry as well as an update on the policy priorities for this year, which you should have separately, and then two environmental issues of particular interest, not necessarily pertaining to legislation that's going to be before you. One is legislation you've already considered, and then just kind of a general topic that's out there. So just to begin with, chemistry is essential. 96% of all manufactured goods are touched by the business of chemistry. Pretty much everything around you is engineered through chemistry. And it's no surprise then that it directly supports more than a quarter of the U.S. GDP. And we're involved in almost every sector you can imagine, especially the manufacturing sector, that are customers and users. In terms of our state, this is our economic impact in terms of the manufacturing. This doesn't include exactly everything. There is some distribution impact with the logistics side, but just on the manufacturing side, the total number of jobs, if you include pharmaceuticals and rubber and plastics, some people do, some people don't, that's well over 80,000 jobs. And I will note that the jobs are very highly paid, an average wage of more than $90,000. So like many others, they've gone to be very specialized, highly skilled, and of course the wages are commensurate. This is, I thought, an interesting snapshot, national data, not state data, but still of the jobs and the types that are provided directly by the industry, which range from PhD chemists to chemical engineers, technical support and sales, supply chain and logistics, information technology, all of which would be postgraduate, and graduate degrees there, as well as supervisors and chemical operators. That would be considered basically the entry-level job at the operator level, but even that requires a great level of experience, training, and skills, especially on things relating to safety. I would note here that it's also not uncommon for there to be as many third-party contractors on site every day as production employees working on things like maintenance and upgrades, at times very intense when there's a plant turnaround or expansion, and that's not captured in the direct figures here from trade and craft, but those are jobs that are supported. And I would note that many of our companies do have unionized production workforce in Michigan. Just some basic facts about us. Again, one of the state's largest manufacturing sectors. We do a lot of export, so we're very overrepresented in terms of our global customers for our products. And I think it's interesting that science estimated 20% of all patents in terms of the percentage of innovation that's going out there is for chemistry-related innovations, either at our universities, federal labs, or at the companies themselves. Automotive, of course, won't surprise you, is a highly represented industry that we supply in Michigan. Every light vehicle on average contains $3,500 worth of chemistry products. Electric vehicles, even autonomous vehicles, you talk about, they're going to need different types of coatings, they're going to need different types of sensors, batteries, all of that stuff doesn't happen on accident. And then, of course, building and construction. Every new home built contains approximately $1,500 worth of chemistry products. Talk to somebody who's building a home, they'll tell you that PVC is pretty hard to find these days, along with lumber. So just an example of what a typical plant might look at. This is one of our companies in Michigan here. I'm neither a chemist nor a chemical engineer, but I'd like to just illustrate for you kind of the same way that I see the industry here and hopefully make it understandable. Most of our companies are business-to-business enterprises. They chemically transform basic materials into ever more specialized products, and they buy and sell numerous different materials, often between themselves, until the materials are ready for formulation or fabrication in a final product, which could be medicine, food, personal care products, car parts, clothing, electronics, you name it. And every chemical plant looks a little different, but on the whole, what you would see is large storage tanks, lots of pipes going back and forth into the buildings themselves where the process equipment is located. That process equipment usually just includes more pipes and tanks, and it's really just essentially a lot of pipes and tanks. Maybe some columns, which are a tall version of a tank that kind of looks like a pipe. You get the picture. The logistics have tank trucks and maybe tank rail cars going in and out, and it doesn't look like a lot to to the visible eye, but it's highly specialized, and each plant can cost hundreds of millions of dollars to build and or expand. Some of our plants have several $billion of capital, equipment that is in there over time. An example here you can see of just what the chemical value chain looks like. There is a number of different basic types of chemistry, but this one is ethylene. This is an organic chemistry chain. For those of you that did study science in college, I studied political science, a different type altogether. But with ethylene, it comes from crude oil or natural gas, then converted into ethylene, and then into a number of various intermediate or final products. And again, organic chemistries are made from carbon-based feedstocks like oil, gas, or biomass. There are increasingly bio-based feedstocks being developed for some of these chemistries. Here's an example of an inorganic chemistry chain. This is actually the kind of chemistry that Michigan got its start with. We have a lot of salt and brine underground. Some of you may know this. There's still a lot of salt and brine in millions of years worth. In fact, that's still down there. And we got to start here by converting these kinds of things into various products. With a few exceptions, our industry in Michigan no longer extracts materials directly or even converts the raw feedstocks here. That's usually done elsewhere, but there are a few examples where we are still using the salt and brine for chemistry. This is a chloralkali chain. So, just talking how the industry is regulated, something you probably have an interest in, of course, being in the policy space. Many federal and state agencies here. So there are state counterparts for some of these, not for all. EPA is predominant. They regulate actually chemicals and commerce as well as just the general things of manufacturing in terms of air, water, waste cleanups. And then EGLE, of course, at the state level is someone we work with very frequently. Products are also regulated by the FDA, the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Then you get into OSHA or MIOSHA at the state level. The DOT has oversight of transportation. And then Department of Homeland Security actually started something after 9/11 when DHS came into being. They do have a chemical safety initiative, and it does include a cyber component to it. Something I'm not totally familiar with, but certainly we're focusing on more and more these days is the cyber side. And actually DEA too. So if there's chemicals that can be used for illicit drugs, and they have a separate regulation. I would also add that there are a number of industry voluntary codes, essentially, that we go beyond compliance with, and these include responsible care and responsible distribution. So these are like an ISO performance certification that involve the processes, reporting and audits, and these are ever evolving, ever developing and more stringent. And I will say, though, that they have been very successful. Responsible care companies have employee safety records that are 5 times better than the average manufacturing sector as a whole, not even considering the rest of the workforce. So we take safety very seriously. Most companies have impeccable records in terms of reportable incidents. So in terms of our 2021 policy priorities here, we divide them into 3 general categories. And the first categories, 2 categories here are more evergreen. The last is kind of more particular to COVID, and I hope we can actually kind of move this into the rearview mirror a little bit like all of us. Our companies have operated as essential critical infrastructure throughout the pandemic. So we have not been shut down, but there have been many challenges as we work to keep up with the federal and state mandates and just the whole host of everyday issues that COVID has presented. But I should say that I'm very proud of the work our companies have done, both to supply essential public goods that we rely on, as well as shifting production to make things like hand sanitizer, PPE, and other medical equipment, disinfectants, and even the COVID-19 vaccine here by Pfizer. In terms of the mission statement there, I would just note that we recently updated this mission statement to reflect that we work to promote and grow a safe, sustainable, and competitive business of chemistry in Michigan. And this is a progression over time, where safety has always been, first and foremost. And it used to be the focus was environmental responsibility. That was the term. And now we've evolved to sustainability, because that goes further and it reflects that we have increased expectations as an industry of ourselves, and our customers have increased expectations of us. So as you can see in the notes, though, well, I do have 2 kind of issues specifically I want to touch on in terms of recycling and decarbonization, but I don't know if there's any questions on any of this so far before we get into those.
Representative Sowerby. Oh, Ken Bemsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for being here today. Going back to your, the chemical chain and the
Yes.
values, I guess this is, those of us that are pro Line 5, try and get through to people who may not be, by using, I guess, either language or trying to point to charts like this. You know, if we are against crude oil, what does that mean for our daily lives? And I think, you know, certainly your organization and what this chart provides just is a great example of, we don't want crude oil, what are we giving up? And that's the conversation I think so many people are not having. So is there anything your organization can do to kind of help people realize where things come from? Or I feel like that's what we're missing when we have these conversations and people don't like companies, or they label them as, you know, not good for the environment. But is there anything else we should be doing to kind of help people understand where things come from?
Yeah, thank you, Representative, for the question. I would agree generally with the assessment there. What I would always say about, you know, moving to electric cars is something I'm considering. You know, electric car may not run on a fuel, but it has to be made from an energy product. Most of the products there, and they come from somewhere. And yes, we are moving towards bio-based, and there's different ways we can do things that are certainly more sustainable. But it is a basic fact of life. A lot of those materials come from oil and gas. So as long as we're using those, how do we use them safely, sustainably? And I think that's why we've always said, yeah, Line 5 is just more than about the car that goes into the fuel that goes into the car. It's about the car itself and many other products. I think the refinery from Ohio illuminated some of that. I'm learning things too about the products that they're making down there that our companies frankly rely on. So I would agree with that.
I had a very generalized question. I too am a political science major, so I'm not going to ask very many technical questions. But being on the Thumb area, when you go to the St. Clair River near Port Huron, you look across the river, there's an incredible line of chemical facilities in that particular region. Is there some reason for that as to why they're all on the Canadian side, or why they're located at that spot?
That's a very good question. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've learned more about the Sarnia operations. It's not people that we work directly with our companies, but I would hazard a guess that they got their start from the salt and the brine that was underneath. And you're talking something that was probably 100 years ago by now, and that accident of kind of geography and the natural resources that led to that. And then typically what happens is there's kind of a critical mass, and industry develops around each other because there's, you know, economies of scale once you have something located there to continue to develop it. Michigan has some of that still, but a lot of it has gone down to Louisiana, Texas as a result, where the same thing has happened since World War II, really. So,
Representative Eisen has a question.
Since that's called Chemical Valley in my district. Part of the reason for that, I'm just going to help you answer your question, is that we have a main waterway that bring in products, and they use that water for cooling. You know, they bring that water in, they cool their whatever they have to cool down, so it's a good source of cool water so that they can operate their do their operations. And we used to go across to Canada when it was cold and swim in that warm water. So just telling you kind of crazy things. So, but that's the way I was told. And it was just, a lot of it was dealing with shipping. So.
Great, thank you. I'll pass on the swimming, thank you. Okay, go ahead and continue.
okay, thank you very much. No, appreciate the conversation. First, I just want to touch on recycling and circularity. And of course, thank you so much for the committee's consideration and support of the Part 115 bills that the House also took up and passed. But just to touch a little more, I wanted to show you some visuals in terms of the materials management hierarchy. Again, reduce, reuse, recycle, recover, followed by landfill being least preferable. The next slide, I think, is just kind of interesting in terms of plastic packaging in particular. A lot of people wonder, why this is, essentially, and there's good reasons. Plastic packaging significantly preserves the life of food, and when you go shopping at the grocery store, the vast majority of the environmental impact actually comes from the food itself, the product, like meat especially. And so they use a small amount of packaging to preserve that food. And to focus only on the packaging as an environmental issue and not on why the packaging is used in the first place kind of misses the bigger picture. So there's many reasons for this, but we do focus on improving the packaging sustainability. This is just to talk about some of the alternatives here to plastic. Steel, aluminum, or glass. Plastics do perform just as well, and you can see that the top notion is that there's environmental impact and resources with all of them, but the same amount of, or the same performance can be found from a much lower amount of plastic. So, example, a Snapple juice or baby food, stuff that used to come in glass containers, or coffee grounds, which used to come in a metal container. They've shifted to plastic because it's lighter weight. They can do the same with less. But that's absolutely to agree we must be more sustainable. The current business as usual is not acceptable, where we're frankly not recycling much of this. It's being wasted. This talks about how we can do it in a better way, but we think the better way is in that direction, and not just to switch back to metal or glass. Not that there's anything wrong. They all have their place for different purposes, but one of the specific ways we can be more sustainable I've talked about is advanced recycling. I recently had the opportunity to visit one of these facilities for myself just last week Friday. I found it very interesting, and I kind of wanted to give you what I thought the takeaways were. What these processes are, they use a chemical process instead of a physical process to convert plastics back to their basic molecular components. And these can be other virgin-grade plastic resins, specialty chemicals, the building blocks, or fuels. And they can be used as an alternative. They have a lower carbon footprint and replace the virgin from the ground fossil-based products. This is a pyrolysis process, which is one specific kind. It basically heats the plastic that's been shredded up in an oxygen-free chamber until it vaporizes. Then they cool it down and convert it into any number of other types of products. And this is being done on an industrial scale at a facility called Brightmark Energy, which I visited, 90 minutes south here of Lansing on I-69. And once operational fully, the facility will be able to process 100,000 tons of post-use plastics every year into fuels, naphtha, and waxes. And it is a $260 million project, and they're already looking at plans to expand further. I thought this facility was very impressive. Because it can take all sorts of mixed plastics. One of the common problems with traditional recycling is sorting it out and finding a value for it, even including car seats. Anything literally that's plastic could be chopped up and thrown in there, and their facility can use that. Especially some of the 3 through 7 plastics, that would include something like my water bottle right here, would not have any value currently in the recycling market, but could be used in a process like this. So I think there's just a lot of economic opportunity here. There's a lot of demand for recycled content that's happening in the commodity markets as companies make commitments to use more recycled products. And I learned actually that Michigan only recovers about 100,000 tons of plastics every year through our recycling system. We're not talking about the bottle system that is actually separate. That's its own kind of stream, but just mixed plastics through our recycling sortation facilities. So I think this kind of illustrates something, that there's a plant that's already coming operational that can essentially use everything that we're producing in a given year. And we could build our own facility like this to convert our plastics, or supply it with our post-use plastics. But that we have a lot of room to grow. And frankly, we need to grow in terms of our recovery and sortation capability to be able to supply this kind of material. So it's a chicken and the egg situation. There needs to be a demand, but there also needs to be a supply. And we think the state has a role in promoting the development of recycling infrastructure to encourage investment in jobs in a more circular economy. And I think, again, recycling is more preferable from both an environmental perspective as well as an economic perspective. That's why I'm so passionate about the issue, and again, appreciate the work that you guys did on the legislation earlier this year. So, questions on the recycling piece, I guess, or I could proceed and I just want to talk about the climate and carbon piece.
Well, we do have at least a couple questions. Representative Ayash has a question.
Yep. Thank you for highlighting the advanced recycling. Can you share a little bit more about practical use of what these plastics, for example, at the facility in Indiana, can be used for? I know in your slide you mentioned a couple things, but I'm wondering if you can share like a practical, real world use example of that.
Yes, good question. Thank you, Representative. So right now, this facility has been set up to produce basically 2 major products, and that's diesel fuel, which they have an offtake agreement with BP, so it'll go to the BP refinery. So it's basically a swap-in, and ultimately, again, as we talk the next subject, which is climate, it's not entirely circular in that sense, but it's an improvement, and it's something that we can solve the issue of the plastic waste, as well as producing a lower carbon product that's still in widespread use. The other product that they make there is a wax, which goes on anything from packaging to food and other types of products. Understand there's actually not a lot of waxes produced in the U.S., and they said they're going to be one of the larger U.S. producers once they get going with it. I will say most of our companies are focused on, if they are a plastic company, they want to be able to turn plastics back into plastics. Again, fully circular, so you don't have to use a virgin resource, and at the end of life, it just goes back to what it was. That's the goal. I think we'll see it soon, but it is, I guess, one more step down the road. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, a related issue there, trying to get my hands around this. So they're able to make these two products that have some value, obviously. And you mentioned the real goal is to make it circular ultimately. How do we deal with this whole issue? There's multiple grades of plastic, many of which currently are not recyclable. Are they moving toward having one standardized grade, or what's the theory that we're headed toward?
That is a whole, thank you for the question, that is a whole issue involving lots of different things. Right, it's a question, certainly if you sort it out into different grades, they have higher value. That requires more work, it requires greater types of investment in the equipment, but then you get a higher value on the other end. Facility like this, they can take it all together, throw it in, it can be kind of dirty, actually they use it, but then it produces, it does come in as a lower value and it produces the fuel instead of the other type of a plastic. So there's pros and cons to either types of a process, and it's probably not all one direction. I mean, in Michigan, we would like to standardize, but every community, there is a slightly different type of product that they accept. I think even here in Lansing, they recently opened a new recycling center, and then they could take different things slightly from what they were taking before. So.
Right. Representative Cambenzi.
Thank you. Do we know, or do we have a handle on whether Michigan could also handle a large recycling facility like that? I mean, in terms of just state recycling, but also regionally, I mean, do we know if?
Yeah, thank you, Representative, for the question. I would say right now, there really wouldn't be enough as we're currently collecting it, but part of the reason is because we kind of stopped collecting it. We're not making the effort to do it. So again, it is a chicken and the egg. If there is a market for it, this company would tell you they want to put a value on these products. And once you value something, once you're able to pay somebody to take it, there's an incentive for them to provide it to you. And I think that's the way that the market works, which is a huge part of this. There's policy, but there's also just the economics. So I would say, yeah, certainly if you look at everything that's going into a landfill, more than enough that's out there. It's just going to the wrong place right now. So.
Very good. I guess that's the questions on that topic anyway.
Okay. Well, lastly, I just wanted to talk about the topic of climate and decarbonization efforts. And I'm not actually looking to invite any sort of political debate on this. I just wanted to be kind of open and give you a sense of something that we're looking at, that industry sees as a priority. This is a picture of all of industry. It doesn't include transportation, doesn't include the energy sector. It's just industry. Things like steel, cement, and chemicals are all essential to us, both in Michigan, across the U.S., and worldwide. But they produce major carbon emissions. And many companies have made commitments to achieve carbon neutrality by the date of 2050. That's kind of been the consensus that we need to do in order to achieve, in order to avoid global harm. I agree this is a global issue. It's not something we can solve all by ourselves as a state, but we know that we have to do this in the right way. And as a company, or as an individual representing companies that do business here in Michigan, I want to use it to drive business competitiveness in the state. This is a chart that just shows again, a reminder of the raw material that our industry uses in terms of energy. So we use it as a raw material as well as in the manufacturing processes for heat, steam, pressure, and electricity. In terms of what carbon emissions look like, I'm not a climate expert, but I'm learning a lot about these kinds of issues. Scope 1 is what's called the direct emissions at a facility. It's something you can control. It's your emissions. Scope 2 is other parties, usually the utility that you purchase electricity or steam from. And Scope 3 then is the value chain, how your products are transported, how they're used, the employees, and the activities that they do when they travel. Those are kind of a little bit less out of your control still. And they all overlap with other people's scopes. So altogether, a company looks at this and they add up, what's my carbon footprint? I should note that we are an active participant in the Governor's Climate Council that's been initiated there, and I don't know what kind of recommendations will come out of that. It's still ongoing, and if there will be potential legislation recommended or not, obviously, that's its own conversation. That's your job as legislators, is to consider that one way or the other. But I think instead of jumping to what the policies should be, looking at it from a technical perspective, what would our industry need to do in order to be carbon neutral? And these are some of those things. Low and zero carbon electricity. Having abundant and competitive low cost helps everybody. So renewables, nuclear, things of that nature. Battery storage will help everything in terms of being able to use that energy different times. Energy efficiency is just using less energy overall. That's the easiest and best option. Something that's being heavily investigated is carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, or direct CO2 capture. Either the idea that we can take carbon that's coming out of a plant itself, whether it be a cement plant or a chemical plant or a power plant, and put it underground where it will never come back out, or use it in some other way. And even, theoretically, the idea that you can take carbon directly from the air, suck it out, and then put it back underground. It sounds very sci-fi, but it actually is a thing. Whether it can be economic is, I think, the question. Again, use of bio-based materials. If you can use wood products in your process, those naturally capture the carbon during their growing process. Our companies will have to electrify probably their industrial processes to make steam instead of using natural gas. Things like hydrogen also is low carbon. It can be used by industry. So all that is to say, that is, from an industry perspective, if we develop these kinds of things, these technologies, we can have a competitive advantage. If we figure these out sooner and better than China or Europe, we will benefit. On the other hand, if we don't do it as well, we will lose out. Those jobs will go elsewhere if they solve these issues before we do. So I see some of the major kind of policy questions. Again, what is the role of innovation versus policy, whether it's global policy, federal policy, state policy? I would just add, and I don't know if there's disagreement with this, but just because something is a good idea doesn't mean that any government, let alone the state of Michigan, should require it. There may be some things, there may not be. Some industries are competitive, energy intensive, and trade exposed, and steel is certainly one of those, cement, and chemical to some extent. That means if we solve the carbon issue, but we don't do it in a competitive way, those jobs will just go elsewhere. And frankly, they'll have higher carbon emissions there, and then we'll be screwed, pardon my French, from a climate perspective without having the jobs. That's not something we want to do. So just one of the last things, kind of industry has come around to the idea of price signals. So letting companies be able to figure out the best way to do this on their own. Transparent, predictable, technology neutral, market-based, economy-wide, to achieve that same outcome, but allow for flexibility and innovation to meet that goal. And I think that's the question that's being debated in Washington right now, to some extent in other state houses, and maybe potentially in this state house, or from the Governor's Climate Council. So that's kind of my presentation there. You had the jokes already in front of you, so I won't belabor those. They're not very good. So thank you very much. And again, any questions?
Yes.